Hello, and welcome back to Parley, the series where you folks support the other things I make by making me talk about the question of your choice for $9 a month. This month, Scoomslayer has chosen idle or incremental games. Yes, a topic I haven't discussed much yet, have I? Scoomslayer says, what's your opinion on idle or incremental games? What I mean by that are games in the vein of cookie clicker, which includes some passively gained resource that can be spent on things that allow you to gain progressively more of that resource. Often these games include some kind of prestige system that allows the player to wipe most of their progress while keeping certain parts and getting some benefits for future fresh starts. And then you've got a little spoilered out part that I'll use later. Right. An interesting subject. The way I like to think of this is very much the same thing as with games with really interesting buildcraft in them. I think that there is a game like that for a variety of tastes. And people kind of lump them together, and they're really not that similar. And the differences are many, but one of them is the level of mental load on the player, the complexity, you could say. And I think at first it would be natural to look at a game like Cookie Clicker and say, well, isn't the point of this game that it has very few mechanics? But I was thinking about this thing in my eye and the popularity of games like Candy Crush and such. I don't know that much about this genre of games, but I do know a little bit. And, you'd think the appeal of those games would be simplicity, but in fact, a lot of them do have pretty well fleshed out mechanics. So, it seems like they're not directly going for only simplicity. What are the other differences from other types of games? For example, I play a few mobile games, but I don't play this kind of game. So why not, basically? One thing I think is the shortness of gameplay session. You can play these types of games, these cookie clicker type of games, for a very short amount of time. Now, you can play, a lot of mobile games for a very short amount of time. There are some that you can't. If you play, PUBG on mobile, or someone very close to me plays Apex Legends on mobile a lot. And these are games that are, kind of happening live. You can't just stop in the middle, really. I mean, you could and just say, whatever, I'll just die. But you can't really finish playing that round if you need to stop in the middle. Does that make sense? So in some ways, these are games that make your phone into a console. Really you need to be in a place where you're sitting down and you're going to be uninterrupted for the most part. If you're on the subway or some such, I reckon you don't mind if one of the, 5 games that you get in gets interrupted. That might be okay with you, but you wouldn't want to be in a situation where you would likely need to quickly whip your phone away, right? That would kind of make these games not as much fun. There are a lot of mobile games, a lot of the ones I play, that where this is fine. You can do it, but you would be interrupting a gameplay session. There's a way in which it feels like you like to get to finish, doing what you're doing. And there, I think, is a second kind of unique thing about these idle incremental clicker games, is that they arguably do not have a gameplay session length. Something that distinguishes a lot of other types of games is how long their gameplay loop is. A lot of developers have famously said that they think, the moment-to-moment gameplay loop is like 6 seconds, basically. I think it's interesting how Dungeons and Dragons combat in 5th edition is also 6 seconds. It's meant a round or an action. It can be conceptualized as what you can do in 6 seconds. You could say it that way. I think that's an interesting number. I don't think that's very universal. I think that in a lot of games, it's clearly not specifically 6 seconds, but it's an interesting metric to use. And so you might be a little bit confused by what that is meant to mean. If you play a shooter, for example, the idea is that a lot of engagements or the time to kill, or again, like you're not just going to shoot the enemy, they stand there and they die, hopefully. Those engagements are in the ballpark of 6 seconds. The magnitude of the length of those fights is measured in 6-secondness. It's around that amount of time on average, not specifically. But that's the type of amount of time before you sort of switch gears and do something else. It's true that humans usually don't switch gears too quickly, and so you would probably find if you looked at a game like Warframe where you can swap weapons very quickly, that people probably mostly don't more often than something like that, for example. There are a lot of ways you could try to conceptualize to what degree is that the case. But the point is, there's this sort of defined length of gameplay loop. And in these clicker games, I would argue this may be almost the only genre where there really isn't any measurable length of gameplay loop. You could say it's instantaneous. You click, that is the gameplay loop, right? Again, I don't play these games, so I might be missing something there. But conceptually, I think that what defines that genre, to some extent, is that the length of the gameplay loop is like infinitesimal, that it's practically zero, which is quite unique. Again, my point is that although there are a lot of mobile games where the gameplay sessions are short and you can stop in the middle, you still didn't complete a gameplay session. Whereas in a game like Cookie Clicker, there sort of is no completing a gameplay session. If you open the game at all, the time it takes to do one click is a gameplay session in a way. Does that make sense? So I do think that's unique. But and now there's a whole other category thing, but I do think that's a very distinct thing about that genre of game. Other stuff. So the ease or uncomplicatedness of getting your serotonin response from these games. Yeah, this is related to the complexity thing from before. Part of the short gameplay loop or having your gameplay loop interrupted, whichever one it is also that if a game has, a lot of thinking involved in playing it, then your train of thought might be interrupted. If you're playing a game where you're doing a turn-based battle over the course of, 10 turns, it's like a boss fight or something, then you might want to pick up where you left off mentally, which can be challenging if you have to stop in the middle to do something or whatever. And a game like Cookie Clicker, probably eliminates that, right? Obviously, but then also it's letting you get the fulfillment, sort of the reward, very quickly. You do a tactile thing, you get a thing out. I also personally, as someone from the outside, I often think of games like Cookie Clicker as a little bit like a fidget toy. I do this relatively frequently, often while I'm recording Parley. This is one that I really like. That's on my desk a lot of the time. This is a bronze machined little mechanism, and here it will rotate. It'll spin like that, often quite fast. What I usually do is aggressively flick it and then just watch it go. It's got enough momentum. This is a little bit heavy. It's a big piece of metal that you can kind of feel the momentum moving in it. And I will quite compulsively do this. Lots of people do stuff like that, but this is something I can definitely relate to. So the idea that somebody would enjoy just clicking and then you see the result of the action. Look how smooth the movement is. Look at how smoothly it spins. Look at that. That's awesome. This wasn't cheap, by the way. This was machined by someone on Etsy. And this is not like a trinket. This is like a nicely made thing. And I cared about that because it does spin in this beautiful way. You can spin the gears too. Anyway, okay. Let's not get me any more fixated on these things than I already would be. But the point is, I can completely understand the appeal of something like that. And I don't think that this is the type of thing where, occasionally people malign this type of game by saying that it's for people that are very easy to please or what have you, that it's somehow stupid to enjoy this type of thing. Absolutely not. People enjoy getting their serotonin responses for different amounts of effort. That is a phenomenon. I don't know why that doesn't, on the surface immediately make sense to me, but I, for example, tons of people enjoy putting a lot of work into succeeding at something and getting instant gratification. And it is very possible to have a healthy relationship with both of those things. So I doubt anybody watching this is thinking that, but certainly these games are not somehow lesser because they're less complicated. They serve a different function, of course. What's the point of the more complicated games? There's an intellectual superiority mindset there that I would like to be done with. There's nothing wrong with these games. But yeah, I do think they fill that role. I don't think there's There's a weird phenomenon where, from a game development perspective, there almost categorically cannot be as much competition for this type of game in a way because they're defined by having less elements. And so you can't make as many different variations of them. Of course, people have. You're immediately shouting at your screen. But Zandy, there are a ton of different variants of these clicker games. But my point is that they're not really that different than skins, a lot of them. They are almost exactly the same. They just look different, mostly. I think this is the part where we should come to Scoomslayer, the spoiler that you included. You said that the best example of this kind of game that you can think of is probably Exponential Idol, a game that has 2 layers. The first is resetting just the purchases made with the basic currency. Yes, this kind of prestige thing, while providing some currency of its tier, while the second also resets that layer, but gives benefits outside of those. That's too abstract for me, or probably most of the audience, to understand. You can reset the shop, but then you get some... I don't understand this at all, I'm sorry. But the idea is that you can probably build up the... It sounds like the power of the... Not the shop you're using, but you get a currency of a higher tier. I'm very sorry that I don't understand that, but I'm truly lost. That does not make sense to me. I haven't played this kind of game, so I have nothing to hold on to. I think it's telling, though, that there are these stages to these games. It's not like there's nothing you can do to add in different steps. That part I understand. There is some form of progression beyond just letting the game accelerate. There is an element to which you don't just go linearly from a small amount of cookies or whatever to a large amount. There is a way in which you could kind of sort of lap or loop around. Again, prestige systems are common in a lot of other kinds of games. A lot of first-person shooters, for example, will have a thing where you loop back around to being level 1 and you reset all your upgrades, or you don't. It depends on the game. For some bonus, but it gives you the feeling of getting to level up again. And that is taken to an extreme with these games, which are arguably only that system of resetting to level up again. So, of course, they're going to have that type of prestige system. I don't understand this shop idea. I wish I did, but I do not. But the idea that there would be multiple layers of that is what it sounds like to me. Makes a lot of sense. That is essentially the design space in these games. I think something that's interesting to explore is, okay, you've got this theoretically very simple game, so what's left to add? What do you add? If the game designer understands that the appeal is all that stuff we talked about before, then if you want to add more game, what do you do? And I guess it's what you've described, right? This is a good example, even though I'm not sure I'm understanding it correctly, because having these different layers allows you to build up over time without changing what the moment-to-moment gameplay loop is. Adding more mechanics would arguably defeat the point of this kind of game. But mechanics could just be gameplay mechanics. You can still add framing or wrapping context to what you're doing, which is interesting. I also think that it's quite important to these games, to make a final point, that they kind of lack a skill requirement of any kind, usually. The idea being that they are games that don't ask you to have a plan, I guess, and they also don't ask for reaction time. I'm sure there are somehow kinds of these games that do, but my point is it's a type of game that is not drawing on that. It's not a game that focuses on your reflexes or, again, what kind of a plan you have in the long term. Arguably the point of them is that they don't have those things, which is interesting. I think that there is an element of games being a flexible medium. And again, it sounds bad. I feel like there's a pejorative for some people, like, oh, a type of game that doesn't require any sort of skill, like, or whatever. But remember, we're all bad at some things, and it's nice to have something that doesn't particularly ask that of you. I think, for example, that a lot of story-based games are a common example of something no one has a pejorative against, but which don't often ask a lot of the player, except that they pay attention. Now, from a maybe existential perspective, I would be interested to discuss at some later time whether it's really true that story games are not asking that much of you, because it kind of depends what the point of a story-based game is. Generally, they're not designed so that you lose. Anyway, a topic for another time. Just to say, I'm not. It does not escape me that's not that simple. You could argue that reading a novel is hard, for example. But anyway, the point is, having a game that isn't about how good you are at it is no crime, right? It seems reasonable that you'd make a game that just wasn't about that. It's interesting how a game designed with its gameplay loop that way sort of avoids some of the questions that a lot of types of games ask. For example, the fighting game genre has quite a large dichotomy between people that want the game to be more accessible and want the game to be, well, they say deeper. Personally, I feel there's a distinction between that depth where the game, has strategy or different play styles and allows for self-expression. I do believe there's a difference between depth there and the game is just hard to operate for the average person. I don't think you need the game to be physically challenging to operate for it to have depth, but I'm only an intermediate player of this genre, let's say it that way. Certainly not an expert. I don't know. People who've played the game for a very long time and are not overly infatuated with how complicated these games are would be the people to ask, try to design a game that you feel like has that expression but doesn't force the player to do extremely precisely timed inputs they have to practice forever and get carpal tunnel with. Can you do it? And I would be quite interested to see if they felt like maybe you could, but I still don't want that, or in fact you can, but not a lot of progress has been made, or they would say you can't, but we don't really know, or whatever. Maybe you just can't. I don't know. But the point is that there is a whole can of worms that you avoid by removing those things. It's interesting how game design you could almost argue becomes not easier, but more linear. Like there's less wrong things to do if you have a game that doesn't really require any particular kind of skill. There's no ask of the player. You're just trying to get them to enjoy it more. When you add things, ideally, they would make the experience better as long as you don't add something that interferes with it. Although you could argue that's any game, but you see what I'm trying to say. It's almost like you have a freedom to add stuff. It's just that the game has very few things that you can add. But if you were to add things, theoretically, that's just going to be more of the game. That's an interesting place to be in as a developer. It reminds me a little bit of the procedural generation of the modern indie game trend of having a game where you start a run, some random upgrades, random levels, you die, a lot of that stuff resets. Those kinds of games can often add a lot more bulk to them, not necessarily good or bad. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, by just adding more like tiles or levels. Those games are also arguably skins in some sense of the word. I wanted to note that this final point, I actually don't think that's that unique to this genre. This is more defined, I think, by the combination of those elements. The idea that this is something where you add content in a pretty linear way is maybe not that unique. I don't know. I think that's interesting. These games are not as different from other types of games as I think people think of them as being. The stereotype with these games, the joke I'm familiar with these types of games, is that people think, oh, that's really stupid, whatever, but then they do it and they think, oh, that's kind of nice, and they suddenly get kind of hooked in. They have a bit of hubris, I think, that I mentioned in the middle of this parlay. There's an attitude like I'm too good for that or whatever. It's like, no, you're not. That's not how human brains work. It might not be to everyone's taste, but the basic thing it's doing is chemistry. You can't just be immune to it. I mean, you probably can somehow, but you get the point. I do find this genre of games very interesting, maybe as appropriate for these lightweight titles. I don't have a lot else to say. Again, I think I would if I'd played more of them. I'm only passingly familiar, as I've mentioned. And I hope I was able to use your example okay, despite not totally understanding it. It's not your fault. This type of abstraction is just very difficult. It's my fault if anyone's, but it does still get the point across that these games are going to have a progression system much more than moment to moment mechanical, intricacies. which is a very noteworthy point. That is, you're right, I think kind of what defines these games. That is a good example. Anyway, a really interesting question, not something I entirely expected to get, which is always very fun. Thank you very much for asking.